Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about 1970s monster and horror comic books. So I did miss Epic Comic Book Wednesday this week, which is a tragedy, of course. So I thought I would talk about comic books today and a new reading project. I know I didn't have enough, so I decided to throw on one more. Isn't that exciting, Roger? Roger's thrilled about this particular reading project because it is all about horror comic books and monster comic books from Marvel in the 1970s, which I dearly love. And I got this idea from my partner on Epic Comic Book Wednesday, Steve Donoghue. That's right, Steve Donoghue, the Crypt Keeper himself. He talked me into rereading Tomb of Dracula, the fabulous 1970s Marvel comic Tomb of Dracula. And I'm really enjoying it. And I enjoyed and loved all of those horror and monster comics from the 1970s. And so I thought I would, and Steve loves these. If you know Steve, you know that there's nothing he loves more in this world than horror comic books. So he's going to be thrilled. Thanks, Steve. So I decided, hey, since I'm reading Dracula and enjoying it so much, Tomb of Dracula, why don't I revisit all of the horror comic books from Marvel from the 1970s? I already have going on, and I've really been having a lot of fun with my Marvel Master Plan, which is my master plan to read all of the iconic Marvel heroes comic books. I read all of the first run of Thor. I'm reading the first runs of all of these characters from the 1960s onward. And so I read Thor, which ran from the early 60s until 1996. And I'm reading the Fantastic Four right now and having a great time with that. I'm in the John Byrne run at the moment. And so I thought, why don't I also add these comics? Because I've really wanted to return to these comics for a long time because I loved them when I was a kid. The 1970s were an interesting time in that there was this explosion of horror comic books in the 1970s. And one of the reasons that this happened is because of something that happened in the 1960s when Stan Lee decided to do a comic book, a Spider-Man comic book that involved drug use. The character was on drugs. It was the drug comic book. Because drugs are bad, and they are. And so in Spider-Man, Stan Lee did a drug comic book. And the Comics Code Authority, which was the self-censoring outfit that they had going on, and since the horror comic books of the 1950s frightened everybody, it was really lame. The Comics Code Authority was ridiculous. And it always was a paper tiger. As soon as somebody challenged it, it was going to fold. And that's what happened. They said, if you want to publish this Spider-Man comic book about drugs, then you've got to change all of this stuff, And Stan Lee said, no, I'm not going to change all of this stuff. And I'll just publish this comic book without your little stamp on the cover. I'll just publish it anyway. And the Comics Code Authority went, because they couldn't do anything. And so the Comics Code Authority, seeing, which way things were going, decided to loosen some of their restrictions. And so some of the restrictions that they loosened had to do with horror. Because before that, you couldn't do like a vampire comic book or a werewolf comic book or any of that. You couldn't have like the horror comic books like you had back in the 50s. But now you could, and get the stupid Comics Code's approval. And Marvel decided to take advantage of this for a couple of reasons. One reason is that Stan Lee wanted to compete with the Warren comic books, the black and white horror comic books that they were producing that didn't have the Comics Code on them. And those were black and white magazines. But Stan Lee decided he wants to do that to compete with them in the black and white magazine space. But he also wanted color comic books, horror color comic books. And so Marvel did that. They did a lot of that. And some of their anthology series were reprints actually of some of their monster comics from years before. But other stuff was original. And so I'm going to be reading a bunch of horror comic books. Right now, I'm already reading Tomb of Dracula, which is probably the best horror comic book from the 1970s. It is the best horror comic book from the 1970s. And so I'm reading all of Tomb of Dracula right now. And it's wonderful. It's a wonderful comic book. If you've never read it, you really need to read it if you're a comic book fan. And it lasted a long time. I think it was 80 issues. I'm forgetting off the top of my head right now. But it lasted, this one. Very popular comic book. And it was wonderful. So I'm reading Tomb of Dracula. They did monster comics. So they did this one, The Werewolf and Frankenstein. And they also did a bunch of other stuff. And I'm going to be reading all of that eventually. But right now I'm reading Tomb of Dracula. And it's great. But my favorite monster comic book is the one I'll be reading after Dracula. And that is Werewolf by Night. And this is the Werewolf by Night Omnibus. It has the entire Werewolf by Night saga. It has the whole thing. And Werewolf by Night was my favorite. I love werewolves. And this was a really good comic book. And it actually beat Tomb of Dracula into print by a couple months. Which is surprising, but apparently true. So Werewolf by Night, when I was a little kid, yeah, I loved this comic book. Werewolf by Night. So this is the Werewolf by Night Omnibus. I will be returning to this after Dracula. But there were other horror comic books. And of course, to round out the regular classic monsters, we have The Monster of Frankenstein. Now, this is not an omnibus. This is just a trade paperback. They never did an omnibus of this. Because the Frankenstein monster was the least successful of the monster comics. You know, it's, at least if you compared it to Dracula and the Werewolf. I'm not quite sure why that was. This was a pretty good comic book. Here we got some Roy Thomas artwork there on the Frankenstein monster. But this was pretty good too. And it started off with Mike Plug artwork, I believe. Going to see a lot of Plug in the months ahead. He was fabulous. So, yeah, Monster of Frankenstein. That one's coming up. There were also a lot of anthology series, which I will be reading. I have most of those anthology series as single issues, which means I have to actually go into the vault and find them. I've never labeled the comic book boxes I have, and they've been moved like 3 or 4 times. And so now trying to find anything is a challenge, but I know they're out there. The one example I have to show you, because it's not a regular comic book, is The Adventure into Fear, which is an odd comic book to make into an omnibus, but they did. And this is a comic book that started in 1970 that started off as a reprint series. It started off reprinting all of the like horror comic books that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee did. Also, there's a lot of Steve Ditko in here. So it started off as a reprint book and became a book with original material in it, starring Morbius, the Living Vampire, and Man-Thing. So it was one of those anthology comic books, but probably it was Tower of Shadows, which is probably the most important, which I have every issue of Tower of Shadows. I just have to dig them out so I could read them. But that was a comic book that started off in the 1960s and went into the 1970s. Started off with some really interesting original material, and then it became a reprint book where it reprinted all these old monster stories. And eventually it became a different comic book. I think around issue 8, it was canceled, 8 or 9. And then it became Creatures on the Loose, which was my favorite monster horror comic book from the 1970s, other than Werewolf by Night. It was a great anthology of horror nonsense and science fiction and other stuff. Creatures on the Loose. So I will be reading the entire Tower of Shadows. I'll be digging those out and reading those again. And Creatures on the Loose. So I'll be reading all of those original Creatures on the Loose issues. So, and I'll be talking all about them on my weekly reading reports. But there were also, besides those, and there were a few, there was Chamber of Chills. There were a few anthology series. Was it Supernatural Adventures? I have to dig them out to find out. But we'll be looking at all of those. But of course, there were also some other horror comic books. I forgot to bring out Ghost Rider, but Ghost Rider is going to be a part of this as well. Ghost Rider, which kind of straddled the border between horror and superhero comic books. But I will be reading all the original 1970s Ghost Rider comics as well. And Man-Thing, I know. Don't be frightened. My Man-Thing is pretty large, Roger. It could be intimidating, but it is an awful large Man-Thing. And I will be revisiting Man-Thing, of course. And also all of the second and third string monster comics like Morbius, the Living Vampire. Yes, I do have a Morbius omnibus. I have no explanation for this. But I do have a Morbius omnibus. And there was Man-Wolf, of course, Morbius was a Spider-Man villain who got his own comic book because he's a vampire. And Man-Wolf also was a Spider-Man villain, Marvel's other werewolf, who got his own series in Creatures on the Loose and some other places. So we'll be taking a look at those stories as well, because I'm going to be reading all of those Creatures on the Loose issues anyway. Also, I've got these paperback essential volumes of Marvel horror, and in one of them is the Son of Satan. Now, this is the only way I have the Son of Satan, which spun out of Ghost Rider, I believe. I can't believe I forgot to bring out Ghost Rider. Oh well, I'm tired. It's early. But I only have the Son of Satan in these black and white comics. Got some Gene Colan artwork in this issue of the Son of Satan. This was a ridiculous series from what I remember. Anytime Satan actually showed up in Marvel Comics, it was hilarious. He showed up in, I think, Ghost Rider and the early Ghost Rider issues in here. And he's always very comical in the comics. So there are those. Now this one barely counts. This one barely counts, but I'm going to count it because this is really more of a science fiction thing. But I got to include Deathlok, the Demolisher, who is a cyborg killer. He was, from the 1970s. Deathlok. It's barely a monster comic book, but I sort of associate Deathlok with that period in Marvel. And so definitely got to read Deathlok anyway. So I'll be reading Deathlok. Now, but there was a bunch of other kind of horror characters. There was the black and white horror comic books that Marvel was doing, and there was the Mummy. They made the Living Mummy. What? What do you mean he was a little bitch? Why are you so mean to other mummies? He's insecure. Don't talk badly of the living mummy, Roger. Here he is now. It's the Living Mummy. Jeez. So I have this. This is the Marvel Horror Omnibus, and it's awesome. So the Marvel Horror Omnibus has a bunch of the characters you can't find elsewhere collected. Well, some of them you can. We've got the zombie from the Living Zombie. So that was an interesting comic book. There's the Living Zombie there. That was a black and white comic book that Marvel did. One of their black and white lines of comic books. And it was interesting. So Marvel actually had two monsters that were completely brainless. They had Man-Thing and the zombie. It'll be fun reading about these brainless creatures. And so we have the zombie is in this, the Living Mummy. Brother Voodoo is in here. All of the Brother Voodoo stories. It, the Living Colossus, the Golem. Gabriel the Devil Hunter is in here to, exploit the Exorcist fad that was going on in the 1970s. So we've got Gabriel the Devil Hunter. We've got the Scarecrow and Modred the Mystic, who barely counts, but he's in here anyway. And so there's a ton of monster comics in here, including, like, this is the Werewolf by Night issue that has Brother Voodoo. And of course, the Living Mummy. We've got the Living Mummy in here. So there's a lot of fun stuff in this one to read. So that'll be fun. But there was more horror, even more horror than that. So Marvel came out with Marvel Horror Lives Again, another omnibus. And this one features Blade. It has some of the 1970s adventures of Blade the Vampire Hunter. It doesn't have everything, but I think it has a lot of the 70s stuff in here. But it also has Satana, the Devil's Daughter, Lilith, the spawn of Dracula, Ulysses Bloodstone is in here, and we've got Manphibian. I think there was one Manphibian story from Legion of Monsters. So Manphibian's in here, who is basically the creature from the Black Lagoon, only Marvel. We've got John Kowalski, Agent of Death, Hodiah Twist, Investigator of the Unknown, and the flesh-eating Wendigo. The Wendigo is basically just a Hulk villain, I think, but he got his own story in one of those Marvel horror comics, so they had to include Wendigo. So this is full of cool stuff. A lot of the old black and white stuff are in these Marvel horror omnibuses, so that's going to be fun. This next one, again, I mean, if Deathlok barely counted as a science fiction thing, this one really barely counts. But I'm going to read it anyway because I've been wanting to read these for a long time. And that would be Marvel's Planet of the Apes comics from the 1970s, which were magnificent. Probably, in fact, definitely, I think, one of its best black and white series was Planet of the Apes. This was just fantastic. This series based, of course, on the Planet of the Apes movies. But we had a whole series of stories from Mike Ploog, which were amazing. All black and white stuff that were reprinted by Boom, right? Yeah, Boom Studios reprinted all of the black and white Planet of the Apes stories in these 4 archive editions. And I have them all, and so I'm finally going to read them. But yeah, they're fantastic. This is great, great stuff. And to close out my Marvel Monster plan, the biggest monster of them all, and one of the most interesting Marvel series, kind of closed out the 70s, which is Godzilla, King of Monsters. We have to have the King of Monsters if we're going to be doing Marvel's Monster Plan. Here is Godzilla over at the Golden Gate Bridge, which I see pretty much every day, but I never see Godzilla there, so I must have missed out on this day. Now, this is a comic book where Godzilla goes to America, and it's all illustrated, or at least most of it is illustrated by Herb Trimpe. Let's see if we got the original cover. Yeah, that's the first issue of Godzilla from the 70s. Herb Trimpe's Godzilla was kind of like a combination of a lizard and a horse mutated into gigantic size and breathing fire. So that's Herb Trimpe's Godzilla. And it was tremendous fun. And in Herb Trimpe's Godzilla, eventually we get... I mean, Godzilla is stomping around not just America, but America in the Marvel Universe. So we end up with Godzilla against S.H.I.E.L.D. S.H.I.E.L.D. has been assigned to take care of Godzilla. But eventually Godzilla goes to New York, of course, and fights the Avengers. So this should be interesting to revisit. Steve Donoghue's really excited now. So yeah, this is my Marvel Monster Plan. All the Marvel horror and monster comics from the 1970s, including Ghost Rider, who I forgot to bring in the room. Sorry, Ghost Rider. I'll make it up to you. I did an entire video on Ghost Rider, so maybe I'll find that and link it below if I could find it. But yeah, I'm going to be revisiting all of these comics, and it'll be fun. It'll be tremendous fun. So catch me every week on my weekly reading report as I talk about them. Like I said, right now I'm reading Tomb of Dracula, the big one, the big Marvel monster comic. But I'm going to read them all, and if there's any that you think I think I've got them all, actually. Because if I don't have them in reprint form, I've got them as single issues. I just have to dig them out. But if there's any that I haven't mentioned that you think I really ought to get to, maybe I'm forgetting one or two. The 1970s were a long time ago. But I think I've got them all. But let me know if there's anything I haven't mentioned that you think I should read. Okay, guys, I have to get ready to go to work. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.